Ice soldiers win battles, but logistics win wars. Crashing the enemy's logistics will give you a great advantage. Ukraine is crossing the last red line of Vladimir Putin in the direction of winning the war. The dream of the Kiev leader and the key to end the war. Crimea constitutes an important line for the Kremlin leader that feeds the logistical vein that shapes the future. The Moscow administration made Crimea the center of military logistics and constantly transported weapons, ammunition, and soldiers from the Krasnodar region of Russia to the Crimea. These logistics lines have been attacked many times as they feed the attacks on Ukraine. The last of these attacks in the last day, huge explosions took place on the Crimean railways. The explosion on the railways dyed the Crimean burning red and damaged Vladimir Putin's supply lines. As a result of the explosions, Russia's logistics connection with Crimea was cut official. While the cries of Ukraine's victory echo from the shadows in Crimea, the Russian army is experiencing its worst days here. Let's take a closer look at the red mornings and nights in Crimea. Unidentified people blew up the railway line in Crimea the other day. The explosion occurred around 8 a.m. In the vicinity of Bakhchisarai, 8 Russian wagons were derailed as a result of the explosion. A state of emergency was declared in the region, and the movement of Russian electric trains in the Simferopol-Sevastopol section was suspended. This information was confirmed by the so-called advisor to the president of Crimea, Oleg Krychkov. According to Oleg Krychkov, passengers will be transported to the necessary stations by buses. Then the Russian media shared that the explosion occurred at the beginning of the train. 50 meters of the track was damaged. A 1.5 meters long crater was formed under the tracks. As is known, Crimea is critical for Moscow's control over the occupied territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and plays a role in the supply of Russian troops. Military experts say that the attacks on infrastructure served to disrupt Russian military plans and make it difficult for Moscow to prepare for Ukraine's anticipated counterattack. According to the current report of the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense, based on intelligence data, an explosion on railroad tracks in Crimea disrupted the delivery of supplies and weapons to the Kremlin's Black Sea Fleet, including Caliber cruise missiles. UK intelligence said on May 18 that a train derailed near Simferopol, blocking the only route to the port of Sevastopol, which serves as the base for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. UK intelligence said Russia would take action to quickly repair the runway. Intelligence reported that the blast would disrupt the supply of supplies, potentially weapons such as Caliber cruise missiles for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Any sabotage in this sensitive area would further raise concerns about the Kremlin's ability to protect other important infrastructure in Crimea. UK intelligence said the peninsula continues to play a vital psychological and logistical role in enabling Russia's war in Ukraine. In addition, Ukrainian Defense Intelligence representative Andriy Yusov stated that he was tired of the constant transport of weapons by the Crimean Railway. Andriy Yusov stated that weapons, ammunition, armored vehicles, and other vehicles used in the war of aggression against Ukraine were carried on these lines. On the other hand, the third derailment of a Russian train this month behind the front lines in the war in Ukraine indicates that a new era of operation may have opened up ahead of a planned counterattack by the Ukrainians. During its full-scale invasion, Russia made extensive use of its rail network to transport troops, weapons, and supplies into battle and evacuate wounded soldiers. In response, Ukraine found ways to target the rail system through sabotage, drone or missile strikes. But military experts warn that it's too early to assess the impact of the attacks. As Moscow gathered its forces on the Ukrainian border in 2021, analysts tracked public rail databases to track backlogs. According to Mr. Bulegway, who defined the railway as the Army's central nervous system, the growth of the railway network was driven by the needs of the Army. Russia has been serving its army in Crimea since 2018 through a rail and road bridge connecting the region to Russia. The explosion that damaged the bridge last October forced Moscow to seek alternative routes. Ivan Fedorov, the exiled governor of the city of Melitopol in southern Ukraine, stated in an interview that only 30% of the supplies that pass through the city's railway now come from the Crimea. Emily Ferris, a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and expert on Russia, reported that Russia is using a private railway contingent of around 25,000 soldiers to repair damage. Its tracks, signals, or stations. Ms. Ferris said blowing up the railway a little bit with a drone might cause some damage, but it won't be catastrophic. Yet the exposed infrastructure proved to be a primary target for saboteurs. Russia is shaken by the Crimean attacks. These attacks damaged the vital arteries that feed Vladimir Putin. Putin, who wants to avenge the attacks that interrupted Russian logistics, is bringing his missiles back into the game. Explosions and the hum of air defense missiles were heard in Kiev early last day, the latest in a series of Russian airstrikes on the Ukrainian capital. A duel between air defense systems and missiles took place over Kiev in the early morning hours. Local officials stated that the city was targeted by a large number of cruise missiles, all of which were shot down by air defense systems. The city's military administrator, Serhiy Popko, shared on social media that the wreckage of a captured missile fell in a neighborhood of the capital and caused a fire. Serhiy Popko stated that there was no immediate injury. Popko added that the missile shower was followed by reconnaissance planes deployed over the capital. City officials said that overnight missile attacks were launched in the southern port city of Odessa, which breached air defenses and hit an industrial infrastructure target. According to the Southern Command of the Ukrainian army, a civilian was killed and 2 injured as a result of the attacks. The country's military reported that its air defenses intercepted 29 of the 30 missiles fired overnight in Ukraine. Kiev, in particular, has come under attack after attack in recent weeks after a relatively quiet period that tested the limits of the capital's air defenses. Authorities announced earlier this week that Ukrainian air defense systems, backed by Western-supplied systems, hit all missiles aimed at the capital, thwarting an intense Russian airstrike on Kiev, targeting location across Ukraine. The bomber included 6 Russian Kinzhal aero-ballistic hypersonic missiles, according to Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Ignat. This missile was the most fired in a single strike in the war so far. Hypersonic missiles have been repeatedly touted by Vladimir Putin as providing a significant strategic competitive advantage and being among the most advanced weapons in his country's arsenal. Missiles are difficult to detect and intercept because of their hypersonic speed and maneuverability, but Western air defense systems, including American-made Patriot missiles, helped protect Kiev from the kind of destruction witnessed along the main front line in the east and south of the country. Will the West help Ukraine liberate Crimea? Ukraine is expected to launch a long-awaited counteroffensive in the coming weeks after months of preparations. Most observers believe that the attack will attempt to strike south towards the Sea of Azov to cut the land bridge in occupied southern Ukraine, connecting Russia to Crimea. If the upcoming campaign is successful, Ukraine may soon be in a position to begin the liberation of Crimea itself. This will mark a new phase in the war that will test both Russia's commitment to the occupied Ukrainian peninsula and the resolve of Ukraine's international partners. As the war enters its 15th month, the military situation does not seem to have a decisive advantage on either side. Russia's professional army, largely destroyed in the first 8 months of the war, was supplemented by the arrival of large numbers of newly mobilized troops. These fresh recruits have limited training and often substandard equipment. Kiev can now count on a large number of new troops trained in NATO countries and armed with modern Western weapons. Since the beginning of 2023, Ukraine's partners have increased its arms shipments to include a significant number of armored vehicles and tanks. The Ukrainian military also has the advantage of superior satellite and electronic intelligence provided in real time by the country's partners, as well as a self-reported force of 10,000 drone pilots. International efforts to arm and train Ukraine in the past 6 months have been directed at putting the country in a position where it could divide Russia's forces and threaten to cross the Kremlin's Crimean red line. Still, doubts remain over whether Ukraine's partners will support efforts to liberate Crimea if the opportunity arises in the coming months to end the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula. Western leaders will have to decide whether to secure a decisive victory for Ukraine or simply to prevent Ukraine from losing. The decisions they make will shape the outcome of the war in Ukraine and will have far-reaching consequences for the post-war international order. Will the collective West allow Putin's nuclear blackmail to be intimidated? Western leaders need to think fast because the Ukrainian army is ready to advance and may soon demand answers to these difficult questions. Russia is experiencing the worst days in its history. The overconfident Russian army is about to fall apart. The Russian army is completely out of order. If the problems in the army are not solved, Russia may soon be forced to withdraw completely from Ukraine. So how did the Russian army become like this? What is happening in Russia? To answer these questions, we need to take a closer look at the structure of the Russian army. First, let us take a look at the available data. The Russian army has over 1 million active and 2 million reserve personnel. This makes Russia the second largest military power in the world. However, it has recently become clear that the larger size of the Russian army does not make it a stronger army. It is very difficult to control such a large number of soldiers. There are many reasons for this. First, there are many mercenaries in the Russian army. There is constant tension between the mercenaries and the Russian army and the conscripted citizens. Mercenaries have many privileges, especially the Wagner Group to which these soldiers belong is one of the most important institutions that deepen the crisis. The Wagner Group is one of the biggest companies in Russia. Prigozhin, the head of the company, had a deep influence on Russian politics. That's why Wagner Group soldiers do not listen to the orders of Russian commanders and cause many problems within the army. Soldiers of the Wagner Group do not participate in any of the operations in risky areas. These areas are manned by Russian soldiers who were recruited by force. Russian soldiers are very angry with the commanders and the Wagner Group because of this situation. On the other hand, most officers in the Russian army have not been paid for months. However, the soldiers of the Wagner Group always receive a high amount of payment. There is a crisis between the Russian officers and the soldiers of the Wagner Group due to this problem. Moreover, many of the soldiers in the Russian army come from different ethnic backgrounds. There are 22 autonomous republics in the Russian Federation. These regions are mostly populated by minorities. Citizens living in minority regions are forcibly recruited into the army. This situation causes the crisis in the Russian army to increase. One of the biggest problems in Russia is racism, as the Russian army brings together soldiers of many different races. Racism rises to higher levels. The tension between Russian commanders and soldiers from minority regions is increasing day by day. After this attitude of Russian commanders, many revolts started in the Russian army. Especially soldiers from Chechnya and Dagestan caused great damage to the Russian army. Russia dismissed the commanders who could not suppress these rebellions. As a result of the dismissal of the commanders, the hierarchical order in the Russian army was severely damaged. But these were not the main problems in the Russian army. The Russian army is struggling with a much bigger crisis. Russian soldiers have started to surrender en masse. After this move of the Russian soldiers, the Kremlin was helpless. So why are Russian soldiers surrendering? There are dozens of reasons for the surrender of Russian troops, but one thing is certain: it is because of the great success of the Ukrainian army. Russian troops are suffering a heavy defeat in Ukraine. The death toll in the Russian army is close to 100,000. Fear is growing among Russian soldiers because of these heavy losses. Russian soldiers don't believe they can win this war, so they plan to end this war by surrendering. And the soldiers in the Russian army know that their lives are not cared for. Russian soldiers are being sent to die in Ukraine. Russian soldiers are saying we don't want to die for Putin. Anti-war protesters in Russia are also supporting this rebellion. Russian citizens are saying this is Putin's war, not ours. The crisis in the Russian army do not end there. Having suffered a major defeat in Ukraine, Russia has sent troops and militants from many other regions to the region. Armed groups that Russia has supported in Syria for years have been sent to Ukraine. In addition, many militants from Afghanistan and Iran are fighting in this region. None of these fighters have professional army training. That's why they cannot conduct regular operations and coordinate in a professional manner. This disrupts the entire organization of the Russian army. There are terrorist groups and mercenaries in the Russian army. At the same time, with so many different groups, a new problem arises in the Russian army every day. There have been dozens of reports of Russian soldiers trying to escape from the army, but most of the soldiers who fled the war were captured by the Russian army. The deserters had nowhere to go. Russian soldiers found an interesting solution. An incident in the Kherson region completely changed the course of the war. After the increased operations of the Ukrainian army, soldiers at a Russian base in Kherson raised a white flag and surrendered. The surrendered soldiers were taken to a center by the Ukrainian army. They were identified and then given new clothes and hot meals in a special dormitory was prepared for the surrendered Russian soldiers. This made the soldiers very happy. The Russian soldiers who surrendered wanted to share their experiences with their friends serving in the army. The Russian soldiers made a video and told everything they went through. In this video, a call was made for other Russian soldiers to surrender as well. This video attracted great attention in the Russian army in a short time. Speaking in the video, Russian soldiers said they were treated very well here. The soldiers said everything here is better than in the Russian army. They gave us hot food, new clothes, and comfortable beds. Moreover, our safety is not in danger. This speech by the Russian soldier was soon shared in Telegram groups. Most of the soldiers in the Russian army decided to surrender immediately after this event. Russian soldiers began to surrender in many bases. In this way, the Ukrainian army managed to liberate many towns without any fighting. The surrender of Russian soldiers raising the white flag caused a crisis in the Russian army. Russian commanders tried many methods to prevent the soldiers from surrendering, but without success. Many Russian commanders were then dismissed. This situation increased the tension in the Russian army. By surrendering, Russian soldiers have done enormous damage to Russia's reputation. The Russian government is making great efforts to prevent the soldiers from surrendering. The Russian press is not publishing any footage of the soldiers surrendering. Putin is allegedly very angry about this. The Ukrainian government is implementing very determined policies on this issue. Images of Russian soldiers surrendering are frequently shared. The Ukrainian army uses drones to record the moments when Russian soldiers surrender. These images are shared on social media accounts of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. The Putin administration was making a great effort to prevent these images, but an incident in Ukraine thwarted all Putin's plans. This interesting story changed the course of the war. Surrendered Russian soldiers met with the mothers of soldiers serving in the Ukrainian army. The mothers of the soldiers served the Russian soldiers the food they cooked. Ukrainian mothers thanked the surrendered soldiers for not continuing this war. At this moment, a Russian soldier became very emotional and started to cry. The Ukrainian mother hugged the Russian soldier and began to console him. The Russian soldier said that he wanted to go home and that this war had to end. Then the Ukrainian mother did something that surprised everyone. The Ukrainian mother decided to make a video call to the Russian soldier's mother. She asked the Russian soldier for his mother's phone number. Thanks to this call, the soldier who saw his mother experienced great joy. There was a very emotional conversation between the Ukrainian mother and the Russian mother. This conversation affected everyone very much. Everyone in Russia who opposed this war respected the solidarity of the mothers. The surrender of soldiers in the Russian army was one of the most important events that changed the course of this war. In fact, this was a very successful policy of the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian people always tried to help the Russian soldiers who did not want to fight but were forced into the army. Russian soldiers who surrendered were always treated well. Ukraine's leader, Zelensky, changed the course of the war thanks to his critical decisions. Zelensky, who is an expert in influencing people, managed to influence the whole world in this war. What are your thoughts on the surrender of Russian soldiers? Do you think Russian soldiers will continue to surrender? How does the surrender of Russian soldiers affect the course of the war? Over the last week, Russian forces conducted a series of massive assaults. They used a huge number of tanks and armored fighting vehicles to reinforce up to full assault squads. Russians concentrated most of their efforts in the southern direction, and their main goal was to widen the bridgehead simultaneously in two directions towards Pervomaisk and Nevelsky. Ukrainians started noticing the accumulation of forces and gradual intensification of actions. Already 10 days ago, Russians were relocating their equipment through Pisky via a very convenient highway. Unfortunately for Russians, it was still within the reach of Ukrainian anti-tank weaponry. Ukrainian 59th Motorized Rifle Brigade released a video showing how they hunted down a Russian tank with javelin. This was a near impossible shot because the Russian tank was using the road approximately 4.6 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian firing point, while the effective range of the missile is 4.7 kilometers. However, the missile successfully reached the target and yet another tank was destroyed. Shortly after that, Russian forces conducted a probing attack south of Nevelsky to see what the Ukrainians improved their defense in this region. As you remember, previously, Russian forces managed to conduct a successful attack here and move along the tree line. However, the Russian tank was destroyed already on the approach by getting hit by anti-tank missiles from two sides. The double explosion did not give a chance to the crew to survive. Judging by the trajectory, both missiles came somewhere from Nevelsky. The small settlement and fortifications around it are located on a hill, which gives Ukrainian fighters the ability to control the whole region, including the distant flanks. So any armored vehicle that gets within the range of 5 kilometers immediately becomes a possible target. That is why recently Russians decided to make a frontal tank assault precisely on the Ukrainian positions on the hill. The biggest problem for the Russians was that all Ukrainian units in this region had all sorts of anti-tank weaponry. It didn't take long for the first thing to be taken out. Judging by the horizontal trajectory of the missile, it looks like Ukrainians destroyed these tanks with 8 stone apiece. Less than a minute later, the second tank got destroyed as well. And this time, clearly with javelin that was launched from a very short distance. All tanks had a protective net on top of their turrets. But even though it could help against kamikaze drones, it did not help against anti-tank missiles. After making sure that frontal attacks continued not to work, Russians decided to develop a new tactic. 2 days ago, Russians started using the local geography to their advantage. This time, Russian forces sent their tanks through the gully, meaning that they were out of sight of most, if not all, Ukrainian anti-GM crews. The goal of the attack was to clear the tree line south of Pervomaisk and set conditions for much easier advancement through the settlement. However, other aspects of the plan were very strange. Russians decided to send at least 20 troops to approach the first target by foot along the tree lines, 1 tank and 3 armored vehicles to simultaneously attack the second Ukrainian position from the gully, and at least 1 tank was left in the rear to provide cover. The attack went terribly wrong. Ukrainian drone operators quickly passed the coordinates of the tank in the rear to the GM crews around Nevelsky. The GM crews responded extremely timely and destroyed the Russian tank before the assault units even reached their targets. Without the cover from the tank, Ukrainian fighters on the first line of defense could easily target the assault units that consisted entirely of troops and very quickly killed everyone from machine guns and artillery. By the time the Russian armor emerged from the gully and started approaching the second Ukrainian position, The fighters in the first position were fully available. As a result, the Russian armored assault unit got caught in the crossfire and destroyed before it even reached their target as well. Such an attack cost Russians at least 5 pieces of heavy equipment and up to 40 troops. It is unclear whether such a disastrous attack was a result of poor planning or misunderstanding of the plan. The timing was extremely off, and the troops that got stuck in the middle of the field were doomed the moment they lost cover. The heavy losses of tanks and armored vehicles in this direction that continue to accumulate month after month are significantly degrading Russian forces. This is an extremely good sign for Ukrainians because, as the Ukrainian Eastern Grouping of Forces spokesman recently reiterated, the main objective of the Ukrainian defensive operation in the east is to exhaust Russian forces in the area. And so far, Ukrainians are very successful in achieving this goal.